Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RIBA. We're very pleased to see so many of you here. Thank you for joining us tonight for the first talk of the RIBA VitrA programme, Forms of Exchange, Exploring the Spaces in Between. My name's Margaret Cubbage, and I'm the curator of this series and part of the public programmes team here at RIBA, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We're delighted to continue to host a new series of talks together with VitrA, and this is actually the 5th consecutive year. This partnership has explored a wide-ranging survey of topics, projects, and innovative new ideas about the ways people are rethinking the relationship between the built environment and society. It has seen a diverse range of thought-provoking lectures and discussions featuring emerging and established international voices within architecture. This partnership reflects a shared commitment to add social, economic and cultural value to society and inspire audiences both in person across the UK and internationally, as well as digitally. And some of these lectures are available online, so if you check the RIBA and VitrA page on architecture.com, you can look back over the many great talks that we've hosted together over the 5 years. But this year's programme looks at how architecture as a practice and profession is shifting. As architects respond to challenges at local and global scale, values are increasingly rooted in the less tangible. So throughout 2023, RIBA and VitrA will host a programme of talks, inviting a range of voices who are leading the way with new processes and practices that are redefining placemaking and the architectural profession. The series will address the question, how does architecture manifest itself beyond the structural form? This evening we'll begin the conversation around this topic, exploring how architects are creating spaces that enhance communities and improve urban life. You'll hear about projects that have an impact on how we work, live and play, and are underpinned with new values in architecture, ranging from designs that socially support communities, collaborations embedding and developing cultural understanding, the creation of spaces that enable meaningful experiences which are inclusive and accessible to diverse needs, as well as ensuring that we are building with environmental awareness. I'm very pleased to say that tonight we are joined this evening by Puja Agrawal, Balor and Clementine Blakemore, who each present examples of their work and insights into their practice, responding to large-scale challenges as well as creating an impact on a smaller local scale. I'm also grateful to Dr. Flora Samuel, who joins us this evening as a chair and will facilitate a conversation after presentations from Puja, Jas and Clem. But now on to tonight's event. I would like to introduce Dr. Flora Samuel. She's currently the Professor of Architecture at the University of Cambridge, and Flora Samuel has spent her career thinking about ways in which architecture can be more inclusive. She writes about contemporary practice, education, and housing, and her career within architectural education has seen her drive forward an approach in which research, collaboration, and business skills are allied to creativity, design, and social responsibility, balancing practical knowledge with skills in academic research. So I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Dr. Flora Samuel.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a fantastic summary of my career. I will have to write that down. It makes me understand who I am better than I know myself. Welcome, everybody, to this event tonight, Shaping Integrity, New Forms of Architecture. And we're going to be talking about buildings and structures rooted in place and shaped by their context and values of integrity, and as well the skills needed to produce this kind of architecture and thoughts about the kind of practices that are needed to make more of this happen. So I just wanted to, before I introduce my colleagues, I'm just going to say a few things about where I'm coming from on this one, really briefly. I wrote this book a long time ago, actually, 3 or 4 years ago, Why Architects Matter. And in the book, I argued that to be professional, you have to have an ethical code that puts public good above everything else. Now, that's why the RIBA is royal, because it's got a royal charter, which is about you thinking about the public above all other things. And I'm not sure how often that happens. Custody of a body of knowledge, which builds on the latest and the best research. Well, you wouldn't want a surgeon coming out and taking to your body without building on the best possible research. And I think this is a very important thing that comes through strongly in the RIBA's recent work on developing their ethics policy. And the last one is professional judgment, developed through extensive practice. This is something just doing things again and again. People do develop incredible professional judgment, and if you get a bunch of architects judging a competition or talking about student work, you'll see that how unanimous people are in understanding what actually is quite good. So an ethical code, custody of body of knowledge, and professional judgment, these are the ingredients of high-level professional practice. And we have to know what, where, and how architecture has impact. So my work is really around the systems of architecture. And we're arguing increasingly there's a big move towards geospatial planning and a plan-based, map-based planning system. And I believe, and all my work and the colleagues I work with, that we need a map-based resource showing exactly what's happening across the UK, into which we feed information about social and economic and environmental value. At the moment, I'm shocked to find that people are hiring year-out students in order to get access to their university Digimap accounts. Actually, there's an incredible paucity of good map-based information being used by architects. So we need to do this, and Wei Wang of the UK Digital Task Force argues that we need a digital national trust of digital information about our places. So all my work is focusing on this digital and data side of things. And within the social value layer, we need layers of maps made with communities. And we need hyperlocal data. The maps, resources that you'll find, they don't show what's happening at a very, very small scale. And unless we have hyperlocal data, we aren't going to actually be able to find out how people are adapting to climate change, or understand that if we put a bench in a park, maybe kids would go out to play. These are incredibly important things that we have to collect. So a lot of my work is around what we call active data, data made with communities of social value, which you can put with passive data layers, which are the information that comes through census and administrative data, your Nectar card, that sort of thing. And you can put that together with maps of the environment, motorways, mountains, whatever, which increasingly are going to be including parametric coding to show that things get in the way or things encourage access or other sorts of things. So I'm really anticipating a digital map-based planning and architecture system, actually increasingly in which architectural design becomes something that is automated going forward. So we've been doing a lot of work with communities on consultation, engagement and participation. And we've hardly scratched the surface of the possibilities of working with communities to make places that really work for them. And here we are, it's in one of our experimental urban rooms using the consultation platform Commonplace, which is fabulous because you can press a button on it and change it into all manner of languages, which is great in Reading, where 150 languages are spoken in a local school. So these ladies are putting their thoughts about their place into digital maps, and that's going to become so much more easy. Spatial planning lags behind so badly behind other areas in this capacity. Deep data, smart data, all the extraordinary things bringing artificial intelligence into data is going to be radically disrupt this whole scene. Anyway, on this project, we developed this thing, the Inclusive Engagement Toolkit, the Quality of Life Foundation, and this was led by Stephanie Edwards of Urban Symbiotics. And it's just a really simple little thing of things to remember if you're doing consultation. So I just wanted to flag it up to you. I'm sure this is the things that we talk about here are very obvious, but if you need to persuade people that the consultation effort that you are doing is better than the average, and let's face it, the average consultation is dire, then this could be of use to you. So in the future, in my work, I argue that new architectural skill sets are needed, and we're going to be hearing more about fabulous new architectural skill sets from my colleagues. But I just wanted, in case you're not aware of it, you to think about the kinds of jobs that are going to become really useful and viable and well paid in the near future. And the Centre for Digital Built Britain produced this kind of top trumps game of the kind of skills that are needed for the green transition, including this one, the ontologist, who is a platform integrator, a person who brings together lots of different things. And I think we'll hear more about that kind of work as this evening progresses. But just in case you're not aware also, I put up here Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, but the way that data is being collected and operationalized in our built environment is very, very biased, and is not taking into account the diversity of experiences. So we as architects, have to get our brains around data. This is going to be the direction of travel. I believe that the future of practice is either going to be extremely digital or extremely physical. And immediately my mind springs a practice I was speaking to recently who were doing consultation around gaming, virtual reality, so maybe they're working across the two. But there's some excellent writers back in the 1990s, Gilmore and Pine, who wrote about the experience economy. And they write about the way that people who deliver services, and after all, architects are service providers, they deliver on transformations and experiences. And I think that is going to be very key to the future of where we're going. So I just recently published this book, Housing for Hope and Wellbeing, and in it I make the case for the fact that skills are really needed in data-driven digital design. Skills are needed in valuation, finance, and procurement. Without understanding those things, you're not going to get good things to happen in architecture. Participation expertise, in particular in relation to inclusion, is desperately needed. Likewise, supporting community self-build and supporting community self-organisation. There's so much coming at communities to say that they can't self-organise, but Eleanor Alstrom's work has shown that communities are perfectly capable of looking after themselves if they are only encouraged to do so. And I think there's a real job for architects in that. Keeping people safe always has to be considered. And of course, sustainable design. These, I think, are really, really key skill sets going forward in our field. And I'm looking forward to hearing, I'm sure that my colleagues will be talking about some of them. So with these skills, we can build new forms of architecture that are both inclusive and resourceful. And I think these are some of the key themes of this session this evening. So we have a long way to go. But especially for you young folk in the room who are pondering about your future career, do bear it in mind, these opportunities. Okay, so I'm very, very delighted to introduce my colleagues here this evening. First up will be Clementine Blakemore of Clementine Blakemore Architects. And Clem founded a practice in 2016 with a commitment to producing buildings that are inventive, inclusive, and have positive impact on both the wider community and the environment. The practice continues to enjoy making architecture rooted in place and shaped by context in terms of local materials, climate, and craftsmanship. And Clem started her career as a sculptor and in film, which I think is really a really interesting place to begin. And she spent a year working at Rural Studio in Alabama before training at the Architectural Association, RCA. And she takes great pleasure in the collaborative process of transforming ideas into built form. And Clem has also worked for some great architectural practices. So she's going to be first on the stage. I'm going to do all the introductions now, so bear with me. After Clem, we've got Jazz Balor, from Jazz Balor Architects, and he established his firm in 2018. And he's held positions at a number of great practices, including KPF, J Associates, Alice Morrison. He studied at the Bartlett before going off on a Fulbright scholarship to Yale University, which is an extraordinary thing to have done. He's a regular writer and speaker and has authored articles published in The Independent and New Statesman. And he's also a member of a number of review panels and is a mayor's design advocate and has teaches in several schools. And then last up, we're going to have Puja Agrawal, who is co-founder and CEO of Public Practice, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. She's an architect and planner who worked as public servant at Homes England and the Greater London Authority and at various private practices, including Publica, and We Made That. And she founded the social equality platform, Sound Advice, and co-published Now You Know, a compendium of 50 essays exploring spatial and racial inequality. And she was nominated for the Planners Woman of Influence in 2018, 2019, 21, and 2022. So I wouldn't be surprised if she's nominated for 2023 as well. In fact, she should win it in my book. So we've got 3 amazing speakers. So if you wouldn't mind keeping questions to the end, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. We're just going to go straight from Clem to Jazz to Puja, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then over to you. So store up your questions. We'll be really glad to hear them. So I'm going to leave the floor and ask Clem to come up.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Flora. It's a real honor to be presenting our work with Puja and Jazz this evening in the context of such an interesting theme. So as is often the case when I give presentations, but particularly this evening, it seemed relevant to reflect on the beginning of my architectural journey, which started at a design and build program called the Rural Studio in Alabama, which Flora mentioned. It was set up in the early 90s by Sambo Mokbe, who'd wanted to teach students not only the hands-on craft building, but also the ethics of the profession. So running through the student work, which encompasses a whole range of projects from houses like this one to youth clubs and libraries, is a belief that all architecture, however modest, affordable, and practical, should also be soulful. In his words, that everyone, rich or poor, deserves a shelter for the soul. So I've been thinking a bit about what soulfulness means in an architectural sense, and to me, it's buildings that are authentically of their place and time, materially rich without necessarily being expensive, uplifting but often in simple ways, robust and dignified, and finally which enhance the well-being of both people and with increasing urgency, the planet as well. So I'm going to be talking about these ideas in relation to 2 projects, the Music Pavilion, which was the practice's first building on the left, and Wraxall Yard, which is our most recently completed one. They're distinct in many ways, scale, typology, location, but nonetheless share an approach towards design and function that I think reflect these values. So the Music Pavilion started nearly 10 years ago, actually as my final design thesis while I was a student at the RCA. One of my tutors had a research and fabrication workshop called Grimsdyke Farm, where students can live and work for short periods of time. It's located in the village of Lacey Green in Buckinghamshire, not far from a small state primary school, St John's, which I collaborated with to deliver the project. So this was a few years after Michael Gove, then Education Secretary, had claimed that employing architects to design schools was a waste of money. And so the project was really a polemic, proposing an alternative model for the delivery of a school building through a partnership between academia, providing design and build services, industry providing in-kind expertise, and a local community providing donation of time and materials. So the school site was formed of the original Victorian building with a number of single-story extensions which had been added to over time. And so the double-pitched silhouette of the new pavilion, seen here on the left, was informed not only by the roofscape of the existing buildings, but also inspired by the local vernacular of barns with multiple roof pitches of different scales, as well as the graphic geometry of Agnes Martin's artwork. Early sketch models explored this triangular form, and working closely with Webb Yates engineers, we developed a reciprocal frame structure formed of a series of tapered timber members, each resting on the adjacent one, which seemed to quite a nice metaphor for the kind of collaborative nature of the project as a whole. So we resolved the design through one-to-one prototypes and models in preparation for a design and build workshop that I ran over the Easter holidays that academic year, with a group of students. Many of the materials had been donated by local companies, often with links to the school, and the timber was donated by Hook Park, which is, I don't know if you know it, but a managed woodland in Dorset that's owned and run by the AA, and in fact was through that connection with Hook that I would later lead to my involvement with Wraxall Yard. So over the course of 2 weeks, we CNC milled and hand sanded each of the 170 timber members. This was the team at the end of that process, sitting proudly on top of them all, before assembling the frames on the school playground and then lifting them into place by hand. Excuse the lack of PPE, I do it slightly differently now. I was really interested in the idea of the building work being a social event and how the construction site can be a kind of platform for exchange and learning. But it was also a way, like many of my early projects, to get things off the ground with tiny or, in fact, no budgets. So this was me finishing off the roof structure later that summer. And whilst I doubt that we'll be involved in the construction of any of our future projects, I do think those experiences equipped me with a really valuable understanding of what it means to build something, the labor and effort involved. So the building was phased to allow for incremental completion as funding and resources allowed. This was phase 1 being used as a sheltered play area. And for phase 2, I ran a series of workshops with the school children, exploring options for how to enclose the space as an interior classroom, not so much as a co-design process, but more simply just to extend and expand the building project as an educational opportunity. So the second phase of work involved stripping the structure back to the frame so it could be insulated and then clad. And this was carried out this time by Timber Workshop, some timber framers and contractors who I've worked with a lot. And they dealt really brilliantly with the fiddly task of kind of reworking the existing structure, completing the project in late 2018, exactly the time I was starting Wraxall. And I think there's a really nice contrast in the finished building between the opaque timber front elevation clad in vertical larch weatherboard and the rear elevation, which is clad in this translucent polycarbonate paneling, which emits a really generous, even northern light into the space. We worked with a number of local furniture designers to create storage solutions for the musical instruments, including large drawers below a bench which runs around the perimeter of the space, and these pegs on the rear wall, which were used to hang instruments. And what's really nice is that in the summer, the whole space can open up onto this grassy verge, becoming a more kind of public and performative space. So it's a very modest building, but its spirit, I think, both in terms of the social impact and the uplifting character of the spaces created, was something that I was eager to continue to develop through Wraxall Yard. So this project was the restoration of a series of derelict agricultural buildings into inclusive holiday accommodation, a community space, and an educational smallholding. The site forms part of an organic farm in the West Dorset AOMB, and the renovation is part of a really visionary project by the owners, one of whom, Nick, is here this evening, to improve the biodiversity of the landscape as well as provide universal access to it. So it's on the edge of a hamlet called Lower Wraxall, adjacent to this listed church dating from the 12th century. And the existing buildings were a group of 8 distinct structures, some of which form this courtyard, and the earliest of which date from the mid-1800s. They're primarily formed from stone and brick with timber trusses and red clay roof tiles, and they were used up until about 20 years ago, but were vacant and derelict when Nick acquired them and started working with us to develop the brief and really explore what the site could offer. So in terms of the site strategy, the master plan is really simple, with the private residential area around the courtyard, which is composed of 5 individual holiday lets, paired with a more public farmyard containing a community space, workshop, and a restored Dutch barn for animals. And the overall approach was to really try and make the accessibility of the site as subtle as possible, so there are no special routes, ramps, or handrails for wheelchair users. Instead, the topography and the layout of the pathways have been designed to create gently sloping access throughout. So from the car park, which is tucked away at the rear, you reach the accommodation via a curved path and through the breezeway into the courtyard. So this opening is one of a number of kind of gaps between or within the building which create visual or physical connections to the landscape beyond. The cross passage on the adjacent side of the courtyard, for example, shown at the top, connects you to the boardwalk via a path through a newly planted, low-density grazed woodland. The courtyard itself is quite a calm and closed space that's densely planted, and the farmyard, on the other hand, is a harder, more robust area where the animals are kept and where the biomass boiler, which provides heat to the site using local wood chip, is located. So this is the view through the breezeway at the end of the entrance path. The opening on the perimeter of the buildings is very tall, which frames the view of the courtyard through the lower opening on the other side really nicely. And this is one of the cottages, accessed through the planted courtyard. Each of them have a very distinct character. So the two on the eastern side of the site are more generous, and others more intimate, but all designed to be as inclusive as possible within the constraints of the buildings, which I'll touch more on in a moment. So in the more public part of the site, where guests and visitors can interact with animals, we really wanted to retain the character of a working farmyard. And this barn is just opposite the community space, which is a generous room for workshops and gathering with a separate kitchen that can host about 25 people. So in terms of our approach to the buildings, which offered a really rich starting point to the design, a key part of the process was working with the engineers, the brilliant team at Structure Workshop, to analyze what could be salvaged and what had to be rebuilt. There was already a history of reuse within the existing buildings in the form of these ecclesiastical fragments, which are embedded in the gable end. So the Latin term for this ancient practice of repurposing building materials is spolia. And I think it represents an attitude to construction, both practical and aesthetic, that really informed how we approach the buildings. So much of the timber roof structure had been damaged, and after a detailed decay survey, we developed a strategy whereby some trusses were replaced by timber studs walls, others were repaired and either retained in their original location or moved to other parts of the building. So this was the final drawing by Structure Workshop, which was then sort of translated on site into these instructions for the carpenters. The bearing ends in particular needed either replacing or reinforcing with steel straps, and the design of these was intentionally kind of straightforward, agricultural, and left exposed in the completed buildings so that that layering of history remained visible. The approach with the stone walls was again a balance of repair and replacement. Some sadly had to be demolished entirely, whereas others could be reinforced or just repointed with lime mortar. Like many aspects of the building, there was an extensive sampling process for the lime mortar mix, and at times a real struggle to find skilled craftsmen who understood the materials and the processes properly. And it made me realize that there's a kind of element of nuanced care and attentiveness in traditional building methods that's quite different from more contemporary processes, and perhaps actually requires a certain disposition as well as a training to be able to do it well. So alongside the restoration process was the introduction of new elements. And the approach overall was to kind of expose and celebrate as much as possible, and in doing so, be honest about what was original and what was new. So for the purlins, which all had to be replaced, we embraced the contrast between the new Douglas fir and the original Baltic redwood timber, which had darkened and aged over time. And equally around the courtyard walls, where the trusses land on new sawn timber columns, the junction is left exposed and unlined. Thermally, we primarily use naturally derived insulation materials, not only for their low embodied carbon, but also to allow the building to breathe. So for the roof, we use wood fiber insulation, which is particularly good at mitigating solar gain. And for the walls, we used a cork insulation. So what you see here is the first layer of a lime leveling plaster, on top of which the cork boards are applied and fixed back to the masonry behind. And this was lined internally with painted timber paneling at low level, providing a sturdy datum which can easily be redecorated if scuffed by wheelchairs. Whereas in the community space and the farm workshop, which are designed for more ad hoc use, we left the existing brick exposed to kind of celebrate its character and history. Throughout the scheme, the material palette was robust and agricultural. So for example, internally the floors are exposed GGBS concrete, treated with a dark grey, dry shape and buffed to create this kind of matte, earthy and patinated surface. And the kitchens are formed from plywood and brushed stainless steel. Externally, there are precast concrete sills and lintels, simple galvanized metal gutters, and vertical larch cladding, not only on the restored Dutch barn, which is where it's typically used, but also throughout the buildings, both externally, here on the courtyard side of the breezeway, and internally on a large cupboard where we actually rotated the planks above the central section to create this sort of permeable screen of fins. And I think this approach of elevating very simple materials and detailing so that they become something a little bit more special, or maybe soulful, to go back to Mockby's phrase, can be seen in a number of interventions across the site. So here within the workshop building, where we had to replace this quite crudely built course of breeze block at the top, we chose to rebuild in salvage bricks, but with this recessed diamond pattern, both as a nod to the hit and miss brickwork of 19th century hay barns, but also to create recesses for nesting birds. And on the eastern elevation of the buildings, which had this very ad hoc mix of windows and blocked up openings, we tried to add to this unexpected and informal character by having a combination of recessed and flush glazing seen here on the outside, which on the inside provided really beautiful sort of deep shelves, or for the low-level windows, these little nooks, which my baby enjoyed exploring during the photo shoot. And I just wanted to zoom in on some of the details which help make the scheme inclusive. Nick and I did a lot of extensive research at the start of the project, visiting local precedents. And while we were often impressed by the technical provisions, we were really disappointed by the quality of the environments, which often just felt very institutional or clinical. So this really galvanized our ambition for the accessible features to be integrated as elegantly as possible. All the kitchens have accessible height-adjustable worktops, including the sink and hob, which you can slide a wheelchair under. For the wet rooms, we specified products such as sinks with integrated grab handles, mitigating the need for wall-mounted railings, and just helping a little bit to reduce the visual clutter in the space. Here you can see that the track for the ceiling hoist is discreetly recessed into the bottom of the exposed timber truss and has a detachable motor, meaning it's hardly visible when not in use. And the beds were sourced as frames only so that we could add bespoke Douglas fir surrounds. A very small move, but I think one that was really successful in making the accessible bedrooms feel domestic and as elegant and comfortable as any of the others. And obviously another key way in which the site as a whole is accessible is that alongside overnight guests, it can be used by visiting groups such as this gathering in the community space for isolated elderly people, which was run by a local care home provider last year. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the landscape design by Hortus Collective, particularly in the courtyard, where naturalistic perennial planting provides this really beautiful, intimate garden. They designed an informal structure of trees and shrubs to create this really nice natural sense of enclosure and also help filter views between the cottages across the courtyard. The selection of many native species and vernacular materials was really driven by the ambition to celebrate the sense of place and also to connect to the wider landscape, which can be accessed from the site via the boardwalk, which takes guests right down to the riverbank, providing this really nice sense of seclusion, even though you're not actually ever that far from the buildings. So I wanted to just end by saying that as well as providing opportunities for guests and visitors, Wraxall Yard is also running a volunteer scheme in collaboration with the Dorset AOMB as part of a drive to get young people with mental health and addiction issues engaged in the countryside. So in a way, the restoration of the buildings can really be seen as a catalyst for a whole series of social and environmental endeavors aiming to improve people's quality of life and the natural world. I feel really lucky to have been part of a project with this kind of impact and can only hope I get asked to do such interesting work in the future. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. It's amazing work, Clem. Really, really beautiful. Thanks, Flora, for the introduction. I'll spend 15 minutes just talking through our approach to projects, both big and small. So, as briefly mentioned, my practice does a range of work from domestic projects to large master plans. So, we are a team of 5 in southwest London. We do a lot of retrofit, infill housing, domestic work, but I guess the interesting thing about us is our bread and butter is actually at the urban scale. So urban strategies, master plans, high street strategies, thinking about town, cities, place, context, all the things that form the discussion topics for this evening. And the reason for that is, quite oddly, I trained to be a town planner before becoming an architect, which is a slightly odd way of going about things. But it does mean that I think as a practice we have a very genuine interest in context, sort of using analytical data points, using mapping, using socio-economic engagement and understanding to really drive the architecture that it creates. So I like to think a lot of our work, regardless of scale, is unified by a sort of genuine appreciation for its context, and we let that drive form tectonic and sort of spatial solutions. So I want to spend a bit of time looking at that framework, exploring two projects, both focused on London high streets, because we do a lot of work with organisations like the GLA and London boroughs, and the high street, especially since the COVID pandemic and its and all the issues that stem from that, is seen as a big part of London's recovery from the pandemic and also, you know, associated problems since then. So this first project I'm going to talk about is we called Parade Living. It looks at linear parades. So in Croydon, you can see from the photos on the screen. I mean, these shopping parades could be anywhere in London, anywhere in any major city, and often they're very. We think they're very sort of overlooked spaces. These sort of secondary or tertiary urban centres along main roads in the outskirts of London. They often have a very high percentage of ethnic minorities, people from you know, for whom English isn't their first language, and sort of more recent migrants. And what we wanted to focus on was not necessarily the commercial element at the ground floor, but the residential element above and behind some of these places. Because often, if you've ever ventured into, you know, some of these secondary or tertiary shopping streets, and you look around the back, you'll see that there are some pretty appalling residential conditions above and behind there. And usually it's the people working in the shops who are occupying the places above. They're often overcrowded. Your front door is accessed via refuge, by waste storage. You know, they double up as spaces to store some of the things that are sold in the shops. And generally there's a lot of you know, substandard accommodation. And again, in sort of understanding context, one of the things we were keen to do was to make the distinction between to kind of try to understand how these places have come to be. And often it's the fact that some of these spaces would have been bought by someone 20, 30 years ago. And that freeholder has often moved on. They've sort of assimilated, they've gone on to different things, and they've retained the ownership of the property. And they then lease that out to someone who operates the business, and then the employees in the unit are often renting upstairs. So it's a really unequal power dynamic where the employees are relying upon a single person or a single entity for both their accommodation and their job, which means you're very poorly equipped to go and ask for, you know, things to be sorted out, for a pay rise, because the power dynamic is so unequal. And rooted in our approach to kind of tackling and dismantling this unequal power structure was all sort of, you know, mapping and robust urban analysis. So we started by looking at different typologies, so different types of parades, because not all are suitable for residential intensification. And we kind of set ourselves the task of demonstrating that these types of units, they can not only provide better quality housing, but they could also provide a sort of financial incentive for the freeholder or the owner to take forward redevelopment. So we focus, using a floor area analysis, we sort of set out to find types of parades that are more developable, essentially. So we looked at a lot of often that was decided by height, and we sort of demonstrated that those were throughout Croydon, throughout many different suburbs. And we came up with a code, a module that could respond to so a single design solution derived entirely by context that could be applied to multiple sites. So a simple module, dual aspect, that has aspects to the front and the back, and something that responds to the fact that often there's no aperture on the flank walls. And then we then took that forward to demonstrate how that module could be constructed using off-site manufacturing, either volumetric or panelized systems, because often working in tight, compact high streets, it's not possible to come forward with a purely volumetric solution, and so a panelized solution offers lots of different opportunities for reducing embodied carbon, for lowering costs, and getting higher quality results in terms of build quality. We then set up a series of different floor plans to show that a single module could be flexible, adaptable, could provide spaces in excess of London plan standards. So, people acknowledging that we're working with often migrant communities or people who have slightly different needs. We provided a range of sort of plan configurations, so some of which had open plan kitchens, others had separated kitchens, always trying to provide more storage, and again, making sure that each unit was dual aspect, so you get a very generous balcony to the rear, and then a smaller courtyard space to the front. And again, then looking at how those different types could then be explored in terms of how the blocks meet the ground and how we provide spaces up top. So we're creating a range of unit types to look at intergenerational housing, looking at different family structures, so not just sort of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. And then finally, again, as a team of planners and architects, we're always interested in how something at a sort of fine grail can sponsor wider change along a larger environment. And so this was a drawing exploring how the concept could be populated along several different parades at different moments in a high street, and how that then might begin to sponsor high street renewals. So the ground floor could be flexible enough to have a residential muse, which is the yellow block at the bottom, or possibly independent retail, which is the pink red block, where the units are sort of smaller scale, or a larger unit, possibly a creche, a nursery, or a larger convenience store in the blue in the bottom corner. The second project I'd like to briefly touch on is another high street project. It's where I grew up in a place called Hayes in West London. And this again was using data, a robust analysis of context to drive solutions, because our work on this site, it sort of it put forward the idea that a lot of the times changes are being made to high streets based on poor quality data, and that's resulting in bad decision making and inappropriate design. So this chart, what we've showed here is, I'm not sure if it's hopefully it's kind of legible given the scale of the screen. But what we charted as a form of research, as a form of audit, was in and around the town centre, how the local authority have repeatedly given consent to large, big box development in close proximity to that town centre. So, all the while there are planning policies and guidance on high street renewal, on encouraging, local diversity and encouraging a vibrant high street. But at the same time, the economic high street, or the economic offer of the high street, is continuously undermined by things like Costco, big Tesco's, large Aldi, Lidl's, all being consented in close proximity to the high street. That was always sucking out the energy, because if you're not, we need to be encouraging people to shop local, to have active travel, and a lot of these spaces were just big box, sort of almost American style retail offers where people drive, they don't dwell, they then drive back home. And then in response to that, a lot of the local trade had seen a significant decline in sort of footfall and the amount of people populating their high streets. The council then decided to get rid of the pedestrianised high street and cut down the trees and put more parking in. So this is a sort of case in point about how bad data, bad analysis creates bad design decisions, if we can call them design decisions in this respect. So we wanted to highlight that, and highlight to step back, because again, there is a narrative that a lot of high streets, they struggle solely because of COVID and the pandemic. And what we wanted to talk about was how in outer London, a lot of these problems they're a legacy of 20, 30 years of bad policy making, not just concentrating on the last 3-4 years. And when you take that long-term view, you take that long-term analysis, you end up with an array of different design solutions. So what we did was we explored a range of solutions around the high street. Again, not just looking at the high street in isolation, but broadening red line boundaries so that we're looking at adjacencies. And we came up with a sort of an arsenal of different solutions, because this isn't a sort of high streets they have diverse ownership. They're occupied and home to many different communities, and so they're not places where one singular muscular solution is appropriate. So, we had different things from sort of urban greening, encouraging people to stop, dwell in the high street, spend some money, buy a coffee, because ultimately, if it's just about retail offer, high streets will struggle to compete because things are always easily available online or via Amazon. So you have to concentrate on the experiential dynamic, as well as the ability for people to have an interaction with neighbors, nature and community, and give people a reason to kind of visit. So that ideas like that were combined with opportunities for new housing, because obviously in London we have a chronic shortage of housing, and sort of how we might densify the high street, looking at new active travel routes connecting to a lot of the green areas, so really trying to understand what the special sort of USPs of the high street could be, and how then we could embed that into a new physical, a spatial plan. And so building on that, we were looking at new modular residential development, sort of not unrelated to the first project I showed you. Lots of different low threshold spaces, so allowing new startups, places where people can enter without needing a lot of investment. And then a series of new community assets, like a thing like swap shops or library of things, where people are able to sort of look at reusing or sharing different types of possessions and tools and what have you. And then that was combined with sports and leisure, to give young people a reason to come back to the high street. I mean, there's an interesting fact we found when conducting this work, that one of the most popular community assets on any high street is McDonald's. And the reason McDonald's is so popular is because you can be a teenager, you can spend probably £2, and you've got somewhere to sit with your mates for about 2-3 hours. So, how can we take some of those rules and also some of that learning and populate new places with it? And again, building on that, looking at how this range of ideas can sponsor social, sort of inclusive regeneration, resilient economy, so that, things like looking at a circular economy, looking at providing new workspaces so the high street takes on a role beyond just retail. And then also, I can't read the rest of that from here, but other different dimensions. So, looking at sports, leisure, and a range of things. So it's not a singular one-size-fits-all solution. It's stuff that's completely of a place that comes out of the research that we did. And I'll just end on this image, which was looking at how one of the ways we might bring back residential to the high street. So really encouraging sort of intimate courtyards to demonstrate that new residential development in the high street is suitable for families. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Great. Hi everyone, I'm Puja Agrawal. I probably got the opposite journey to Jazz, where I am a trained architect but became a planner and now run public practice, social enterprise full-time. And I'm just going to talk. It's probably a slightly different approach to what architecture can do and what architects can do. So yeah, it's going to feel quite different potentially. I'm going to start with a bit of doom and gloom, so bear with me. So we're really facing some really difficult times, starting with some really socially difficult times with COVID, as Jazz mentioned previously. I think it's had a really huge impact on how people occupy space and how we use our cities and places really differently. It also exposed a huge amount of inequality And this has been discussed before, but it's worth instigating the, who had access to open green public space during COVID. And we saw a really direct link of poor air quality linked to people who live in social housing and in overcrowding, linked to people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, linked to guess who was most impacted by COVID. So these social issues are spatially determined, and the spaces have an impact on this. We also have seen a huge amount of political uncertainty starting from Brexit all those years ago, to recent political shifts at quite a high level. And this has actually a really big impact on how that impacts our local authorities and councils in terms of how much funding they have, what budgets do they have to really invest in the places for their communities. And then there's a huge economic crisis around the cost of living and a fuel crisis, and people are choosing whether they warm their homes or whether they eat. And that also links to, I suppose, an environmental connection here about how we sort of move between different places in the city. So there's a huge amount of things that are going on, and we as architects are sort of trying to figure ourselves out within this context. But there have been some really important movements as well that we've seen, historic movements, but movements coming to light from Black Lives Matter about who belongs and how do we belong and how do we fit into these places and how are we seen within the society. To Sarah Everard's death, there was a whole question about how do we create equal public spaces, and again coming back to who belongs and where, and there's a spatial implication here. To the overarching, I don't need to talk about this, but it's really obvious that there's a huge environmental crisis, and we need to really impact contribute to the climate emergency. And I think everyone in this room has a role to play. We all have backgrounds and skills and professional skills that can really contribute to these social, environmental, and political contexts. So the question is, how do architects shape integrity? Why did you decide to become architects? I'm guessing most people in this room are architects, and it goes back to what Flora was saying, is all of us believed in working for the public good. That's what our profession should be about. And so my question about, on how do architects shape integrity? For me, it's about working in the public sector. So I think there's a huge amount of different opportunities for what you can do as an architect by working in the public sector. You have the opportunity to think strategically and not react to just what's coming to you as an architect. You have the opportunity to think in the long term. You have the opportunity to be representative of your communities and serve your communities directly. And you have all these systems and machineries like tools like procurement, but also funding and policy to really influence those places. And local authorities are really looking for people like you to work in the public sector. And there's this sort of stat that we always throw around, but in 1976, 49% of architects used to work in the public sector, and now it's less than 1%. And local authorities are, people talk about budgets and funding being the issue, why there's huge amounts of capacity gaps and under-resourced, why they're under-resourced, but actually they can't attract you, they can't get you to work in the public sector. And in my mind, there's this huge mismatch of people. As architects, I was an architect, I was working in the private sector, wanting to make a huge difference to society. And then you have local government that's just really struggling to attract people like us into the public sector. And this is where public practice came about. So I co-founded this organization about 6 years ago, and our mission is to really improve the quality and sustainability of places. And we believe by building the capacity and skills of local government, bringing people like you to work in local government, that's how we can make a huge impact, a direct impact on places. So the key thing we do is run it's called like a job placement scheme. So we attract people in the mid-career, so people who've worked in the private sector for about 3 to 5 years, and we place you in positions, place-making positions in local government. It is a huge transition. Over 90% of the people we attract to the program come from the private sector, but what we provide is this cohort, this community of support, and provide a learning and development course which helps you transition into the public sector. But you're basically part of a group of like-minded individuals who really want to make a difference, and we help you through that process. Over the last 6 years, we've placed over 200 people in local authorities across England, we very much grew out of London, grew out of the GLA where I used to work, but grew across the southeast. And then last year we placed our first few associates across in the north. We've just, as of this week, publicly announced that we've got £1 million from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities to really take this programme across all of England. So we're really looking forward to placing people in councils, every single council in England. But today, what I thought could be quite interesting is to think about what are the type of skills and strengths you have as an architect that is relevant to working in the public sector. And actually, I think it comes back to some of the questions Jazz was saying, is imagine we've actually placed people in Hillingdon Council, but when you've got the best client, you actually get the best projects. When you have the opportunities to influence some of that policy and think about, which are the high streets we want to invest in, why are these big sort of blocks being built, and how can we think about the city in more interesting ways? This is what I'm going to sort of unpack a little bit more. So as architects, I suppose you have the ability to be both analytic and creative. And that's one of the things I found really particularly fascinating and fun and challenging by working in the public sector. So you'd have the opportunity to see this was looking at small sites across London when I was working at the GLA with TfL, and seeing, okay, here's the opportunity to develop these X amount of sites, but how can we do this in the most creative way? And actually starting to work with legal colleagues and other colleagues to actually design the process of who can bid for these sites and how can we open these up to the most ambitious and creative architects that London has. So starting to actually play with some of the systems and frameworks, which again, as an architect, that's what you do. The other thing is around thinking about scale and having a spatial awareness. This is an example of Alpa working, I think she was in Sutton, thinking about some of improvements to public realm. And again, from your background of design, how do you make the decision that those trees are not getting cut down, but actually you are the one who's making the decision to plant X number of trees in this local area? I think relationship management is actually like the most important thing about what working in local government is. It's all about knowing who is going to help you sort of unlock a certain thing that you're trying to do. But you actually get exposed to so many different types of people and community groups and stakeholders and councillors and political people and TfL, Network Rail, and it's about bringing all of these different people and these groups together to solve a certain problem together. And again, as an architect, so much of that is being able to communicate and speak how do you present your project differently to your client or to a local community group or to your planning inspector when you're doing pre-app. It's so much about communication, consensus building, and relationship building. Problem solving. Public sector is full of problems, and how do you solve them? I think, again, as architects, you know how to solve problems from so many different scales. And even looking at Clementine's presentation earlier, it's just what I loved was seeing how you sort of think about things at so many different scales. And in some ways, that very much translates into the public sector as well. For me, the most exciting thing is actually creating the brief. So starting, as architects, you're used to receiving the brief that you need to design this community project with X amount of money in this location, and these are the people you need to talk to. But imagine being that person who's deciding what the project is. Where is the project? How does it all connect with each other in different parts of the city or beyond? And for me, that is what I found the most empowering thing to do as an architect working in the public sector. Also, giving old tutors jobs was quite fun, being their client. I touched on talking to different stakeholders and bringing them on board. And then there's something just really practical about project management and working with complex budget streams, different funding pots, but there's also I find a creativity in that is to make a project happen, you actually need to try and find money from lots of different places within the departments, within different councils. And actually, again, as architects, you should have good project management skills about how the things actually get delivered on the ground and managing lots of different sub-consultants. So I guess just to say, I do really believe that we are part of a movement, public practice over the last few years. We've placed over 200 people. They're still connected. There's still really strong relationships. And I really believe that is where you can make a huge difference as an architect in different scales and different conditions. And just to touch on a couple of examples, perhaps, of work that associates have done at different scales. So this is an example of Tara Bolade, who is an architect who runs her own practice, but she worked part-time in Epping Forest. And she brought her sustainability expertise, so she does lots of retrofitting, and she brought that at a policy level. So she actually implemented a sustainability strategy about how the authority can reach net zero by 2030, working with other colleagues and working with the team, but having even a checklist for what people at different teams or architects or consultants need to be thinking about. She created that piece of work that everyone is using now. And I think, again, using her really direct on-the-ground experience to create a piece of policy is super inspiring and super useful. We've seen lots of roles coming forward post-COVID around regeneration and meanwhile uses. And this is an example in Oxfordshire where an associate created a meanwhile space when people were allowed to meet outdoors. And over time, this has gained lots of love and support from the community, and this is becoming more of a permanent project. But we're also seeing lots of associates working on high street regeneration projects in town centres, thinking about what is the future of these spaces, given that, what is the future of retail? There are more social spaces, and what role does a local authority have in sort of curating those spaces? And then finally, we've had a good few associates who did a lot of housing, working on housing projects, and this was in Camden, working on the refurbishment of a number of estates, and being able to write a good brief, bring really good consultants on board, manage working with lots of different people on the ground, like the community groups, thinking about the public space is, again, a really nice translation of someone who used to work at Neil McLaughlin Architects and is now working within the council and thinking about these opportunities at a much bigger scale. For me, what Tilly says, just sort of, I thought, really echoed what this whole talk is about, that she felt that she was able to use her skills and she felt like a better citizen. I don't know, that makes me quite emotional. So just to end, like I said earlier, I do think there's a huge opportunity of working in the public sector. It's not the most obvious sort of translation of what architects can do, but that's the point. We are multidisciplinary professionals, and by joining the public sector, I do believe you can really make a positive difference. And we will be opening applications up in a couple of weeks to work anywhere in England, so do get in touch if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for some really fantastic and very diverse presentations. I really enjoyed them all. I mean, I suppose I should start off by asking Clem, how is it possible to make a living doing socially sustainable architecture? What are the secrets?
Well, there aren't that many secrets. It is very hard. We were just talking about it. I think for any small practice, it is a real challenge. We were comparing it with lawyers who charge proper fees and then very clearly do pro bono work as a balance. And I think a lot of practices with social ambitions just accept that they're not earning what you probably should be earning as a professional that's trained for 7 years. I think if you want to go above and beyond just delivering the services, you do it for passion, really, and because you want to make a difference. That's just, I think, the way it is, unfortunately.
Do you agree, Jazz? Because do you play things off in different parts of your practice?
No, yeah, I do agree with a lot of that sentiment. I think some of the things what we try to do, and often working on bigger sort of the urban regeneration projects, I guess you try to take clients who are quite commercially minded on a journey to demonstrate why sort of social initiatives can create value. And I think so. Some projects we have are complete sort of, that they are loss makers in the sense we pore over every single detail, and it is very challenging to make the numbers stack up on those. But other projects we have, we try to encourage our clients to do better and try to demonstrate that better doesn't have to be a philanthropic thing. It can actually generate more value, and that's also where having good colleagues in the public sector is of paramount importance, because certainly in some of the more ambitious local authorities we're working in, the difference to what they get commercially minded clients to do is astronomical. I've seen really good examples where people, often from public practice, and I think that one of the things Puja maybe didn't mention is the legacy that having someone from public practice leaves. We're working in some authorities where we've had some associates and they've gone on, or they're on maternity leave and whatever, but it does instigate a whole culture shift, and they then, it creates an environment where doing responsible things for people and planet is sort of the baseline, and everybody's expected to do that. Sorry, that's my phone saying it, sorry. Yeah, anyway.
That's really interesting. So Puja, because you've sort of stepped out of architecture and looking in, what's your observation about how architects might be able to do a better job of making a living doing socially sustainable stuff?
Oh, it's a really tough question. I feel like I'm so out of it now. We were actually talking about this earlier. Interestingly, running a small social enterprise, we were talking about the same thing. It's how do you make we're a not-for-profit organisation. How do you make it work? I think, again, maybe I'm thinking about the public-private sector thing. The public sector is trying to open up more opportunities to work with younger practices, with emerging practices, and often they see frameworks as being a way to bring in opportunities. I think procurement in general, again, it's quite techy, but there are lots of opportunities there to help practices break into the public sector and win work. And we have had quite a few of our associates doing really interesting things with procurement to encourage local practices to win work, or having diverse practices win work, and so forth. So I guess for me, when I was working in the private sector, I was always interested to work for the public sector, and that's the type of work I did, because that's where I saw more socially minded work. But yeah, how to balance the books, these two would probably be better placed to answer that.
That's really interesting. We're going to hand over and open up for questions from the floor, but I just can't resist asking you about what advice you have for young architects building on your own experiences. I'd love to know. Jazz, if you're starting on that one.
God, that is a big question to unpack. I think it's about, I think there's probably a couple of things. One, appreciating that you can do a lot of different things with an architectural education. You don't, traditional practice is one route, but there are, lots of different things in coding, AI, like going client side, going to work for the public sector, that are all, it is all different ways of practicing architecture. And I think the other second piece of advice for those who do take a more traditional route is to kind of, what Clem and I were talking about, is to not to sort of undervalue your time and your labour. And I think certainly, that is a sentiment that is probably around much more now than when I graduated. It's changed a lot in 10, 15 years. That I think younger people do recognise that their time has value, and that they're not, it's not appropriate to work 80, 90 hours for little pay. And I think realising that as architects, as an industry, we do have agency. One of the big things I try to advocate for is for architects to do more work, and that's so much, when I say do more work, I mean be involved in a larger amount of building work, because I think there's some ridiculous statistic that only 6% of buildings are actually designed by an architect. And I think if we're more practically minded, if we value our time and we value the input we can have on building projects, I think we can be sort of opening up the market and selling architecture to a wider audience, which will make the profession better for everyone.
I think that's so true. And the one reasons I get so exercised about this whole issue of value is that I believe that everyone has the right to good architecture. Yeah. It's a Michael Sorkin quote, but it made a huge impression on me. Why are people getting such terrible built environment? Mm-hmm. And when you can see the amazing problem-solving skills that we've seen today, these are very unique and distinct to the architecture profession. We really have to be loud and proud about them, I think. How about you, Clem? Have you got any advice to folk here?
Well, I remember a tutor of mine once saying something like, be ready for opportunity, and not really knowing quite what that meant. But actually looking back, I can really clearly see moments where things came up and I just sort of jumped in and went for them, probably because of that advice. And I think often with architecture, you feel very out of your depth. It's such a huge field, this ambitious profession. And if you're ever going to progress, you're always going to have to be slightly out of your comfort zone. So I think just having faith in yourself, but also it goes back to this idea of valuing yourself, not feeling like an imposter, sort of trusting that you can do it and charging fees to do that well. So yeah.
I think that's really sound advice. Thank you. How about you, Puja?
I think we should always work for the public good, no matter whatever scale of project we're working on, and we should be doing that. And I think that is the first thing I would say. The second thing is to echo what Jazz said, that there's so many different routes you can take as an architect, and I think we weren't told that enough and so I really shout about that clearly, that there's just lots of different things you can do with an architecture background. But the third thing I'd say is find your people, and that's something I did for personal support through my entire career, and I still do, is find your little community. We create that community in public practice. We create those cohorts partly because I think having that group of people or support network is really important. So I see it quite a lot happening informally, but even setting up Sound Advice with Joseph was about bringing together a community of architects of colour so that we could support each other. But within your practice, big or small, within the larger community, wherever you live, there's always people trying to are struggling through certain issues, I suppose, or wanting to make a difference. So just find your little group of people and you can make change.
That's great. I think we should turn the lights up and invite a couple of questions from the floor, if there are any. Fierce instructions to wait for the microphone.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes. Brilliant. I just actually want to share something with the room before I ask you a question, if I may. It's just that I was given cause to share this quote yesterday, and it's this, that many wisdom traditions affirm that when we act from deep integrity and align with what we feel called to do, the universe conspires to support us. To act from wholeness calls from more than rational decision-making alone. We must learn to combine the power of the rational mind with the wisdom of intuition and integrity and dare to take the leap. Too often we self-censor, too often we fail to fight for our concerns for fear of being branded a dreamer, an activist or troublemaker. When it feels unsafe to speak our truth, we shut down our inner voice, we lose personal integrity, and we fail to set out in motion the changes the world is crying out for. That's from Frederick Laloux. It's the RIBA's stated charitable mission to advance architecture by demonstrating public benefit and promoting excellence in the profession. Flora, you suggested maybe that we don't see that enough. To whom do you look to in architecture to role model integrity?
Okay. Yeah, that's an intense question. I can. I think with this, a lot of us now, I think in practice at this moment in time, probably look back to people who are involved with the LCC when the sort of, sorry if I stole your answer, when architecture for the public good by the public was in its pomp, really. And I think there are, we're obviously in a completely different political climate where public spending takes on different forms, but I think there are new ways in which individual practices are trying to take forward at least the spirit of some of those things. And the thing I always makes my heart sink is when often clients or those commissioning architecture, both in the public sector and the private sector, see an architect's role as to kind of increase costs and see it as an expensive luxury. And I think if we're ever going to do more for the public good, but also make architecture a better workplace for people of all different backgrounds, it's about completely dismantling that proposition that we are value creators, not sort of, an overhead that just sits above your bottom line. And the more we speak about that, the more we kind of celebrate and demonstrate that, I think that would be a really useful thing to kind of engage with people who did it quite well 40, 50 years ago.
I mean, I would say that there are sort of lots of inspiring colleagues working. I have lots of people with small practices all pushing for the same kind of ambitions. I think what becomes hard is that, as Jazz said, it's so little of the built environment is actually produced by those types of practices that it doesn't really stack up. But I don't have any ideas about how to change that, but I think that's just an observation that I think within our profession it exists, but how do you make that translate into a bigger impact?
I mean, I think there are so many fantastic practices doing great and very things with real integrity. That's why I always ask this question about money, because it should be something that is properly remunerated and valued going forward. And I think the more it happens, the more that will happen. And I look back to my training in the 80s, and what was going on in architecture then was absolutely dire. So it's a great deal better than then. But it's one of the reasons I'm so interested in about data and space, and because this is and trying to operationalize things like social value into the planning system, because these are the ways that we can really transform the situations for architects who are working with integrity and for community groups who are working with integrity. And I don't know, I want to put words into your mouth, but I imagine it's a similar sentiment to why you go into public practice and are working at that level, because there's so much to change in the world of procurement and finance and all these things towards a well-being economy. There's apparently there's an association of well-being governments now. Let's get away from financial economy and into well-being. So I think there's a role for architects trying to influence and change, and there's also a role for architects doing beautiful buildings and really working with people in an exceptional way. I really enjoyed your quote. As I'm hitting the end of my career, I intend and want to be the kind of person that you're talking about. Are there any other questions? A couple over there. Hello. And that's it, because we must stop after already.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
I am very excited by the suggestion of Puja for public architecture, for going back into architects putting their skills into local authority, into public authorities. And I'm the generation who was working in those public authorities in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and public authorities were destroyed politically during the 80s, which was very sad. I was kind of experiencing the destruction. Local authorities have always had a great sense of public value. The public housing, the schools which were created in those days, restoration of, I also worked in restoration of historical buildings, and the responsibility of public authorities and local authorities, as well as the organization within those authorities, was at a very high standard. And the sense of thinking at those days was at a very high standard. Unfortunately, politically, this went downhill, and the privatization and private practices which were directed into money making, into self kind of promotion, killed the social sensibility of the local authorities and their sense of social value.
I'm sorry to hurry you along. Do you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to make congratulate Puja of her kind of call for bringing back the sense of social value into the local authorities and public architecture.
Point well put. Thank you very much. One question over there, gentleman over there, and then maybe just wrap up.
Unfortunately, I'm retired now, but well, I'm 68, so I too have worked in public offices like British Rail. I was very heartened by all three of you, actually. I think what you're doing is very brave and takes a lot of courage. It's certainly not, it's not well paid, what you're doing, and I admire very much what you're doing. I was wondering, particularly Puja, how you make the connections into public offices, public local authorities. Where I worked, I had my own practice in Lewis, in North Street, and some of you may have heard that Human Nature now are developing North Street. This is the third scheme, actually. I was there 23 years working in North Street. Actually, my office was next to Will Hardy, who does amazing spaces. It's amazing the creativity that goes on in these really quite run-down industrial estates. And I'm just sort of really fired up at times, but also very depressed at how little the public actually value them, you know. And it's getting that value risen, that bar risen, which is so difficult. It's a psychological thing, I think. And the pandemic has certainly made it worse. And, you know, if you just take banks, for instance, people are now banking more online. All our banks in Lewis have closed. I think we've got one now. We've got Lloyds Bank. I think it's so important that people circulate, that use, banks, shops of all kinds, because it breathes life into communities. People sitting at home online is not, in my view, breathing life into communities. And I just wondered, I'm asking a lot of umbrella of things, but I'm particularly fascinated how you make inroads into local authorities.
I'll try and wrap the last two as quickly as I can. So yes, we've seen a huge impact on austerity on local government. Just to say, I think local government particularly has a huge impact because they know their places and they know their communities, and that's the level that we've predominantly intervened at. Planning departments have seen a cut of like 55%, I'd say, in the last decade or so. So yes, there's huge challenges, and I don't think we're not remodeling the 60s and the 70s. We're not bringing 100 architects who are delivering housing directly. It's a kind of slow process, but as I showed, there's a whole range of people doing different things on places as a kind of starting point, and that will grow over time. It's sort of showing local government as a position of leadership in placemaking. In terms of how we build relationships, so in London, we started 5 years ago, starting in London, the southeast, and now 5 years on, we've placed at least one person in every single council in London and the City of London. So it takes time. We're really strategic about seeing where the opportunities are, where there's funding, where there's progressive values about what places are trying to achieve, and then we just really take quite a direct relationship building moment and opportunity. But yeah, always happy to be introduced to anyone if you know any good officers working across the country now.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we must wrap up now. I really want to thank my colleagues Jazz and Clem and Puja for a really fascinating set of presentations. I hope you will feel that there's quite a lot to be hopeful about in architecture at this time. And I would also like to thank Margaret for doing a great job, and the team for organising this event, and of course our sponsors, VitrA. And thank you very much for your patience and your interest today.
Well done. Great.